Let me begin by saying thank you to the City of College Station for inviting me to come and speak today, although it was kind of intimidating as I walked through the door and I saw them handing out fly swatters. So if you would, just put those on leave those on the table. Hopefully the presentation will be worth your while today. I'd also wanted to say thank you to everyone who's come out. Thank you for your interest in local history. It is kind of nice to see that. I also wanted to share with everyone before I got into the presentation that I'm a prime example of a person that it's never too late to go back to school. Right now I'm studying, I'm working on my master's degree in history. My research centers on the African American citizen soldiers in Galveston and San Antonio from 1876 to 1906. And that research topic was actually spawned from local history. The city of Bryan actually had an African American militia company in the early 1880s, and then consistently from 1887 to 1900. In addition to that, I'm also working with David Woodcock, who I understand has spoken here also in the College of Architecture, and working on my certificate in historic preservation. And I'm telling all of that to you because, not to brag or say this is what I'm doing, but also just to assure you that I fully support, and I'm aware I fully support your efforts in promoting and preserving local history. I only hope today that I might be able to contribute in some small degree to that. I'm sure many of you, when you got your postcard in the mail and the title of the presentation said, "Where's Dr. Bringhurst?" Many of you said, "Well, who the heck is Dr. Bringhurst?" That's a fair enough question. What we're going to talk about today actually comes from a newspaper, and this is how Ernie kind of found me. But a few months ago, the Bryan Eagle, or Bryan College Station Eagle, ran this headline in their Sunday edition about this genealogist guy digs for details, a little catchy phrase there. Sam Houston's son-in-law is in the Bryan plot in the Bryan City Cemetery. And you would think that being able to mark his grave after 94 years, that's a pretty nice thing to do. His young 5-year-old daughter had been in the cemetery, laid to rest 112 years ago, and never had a marker. So someone who's a genealogist, and do we have any genealogists or family historians in the audience today? So we do have a few. One of the most frustrating things if you're a genealogist, if you go to the cemetery and you know they're buried there and there's no marker, you don't really know if they're there. So it's a simple question and how this all came about. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Before I get into the slideshow, I wanted to kind of back up a little bit. So bear with me, please, a little bit of patience to kind of go into how this all came about. But Bringhurst is an interesting individual. I don't know if you would call him a significant individual, but he is tied to our local history, not only through his connections with the Sam Houston family, but also with the early history of Texas A&M. So let me get into that. So what happened, what transpired? I've been doing family history for about 14 years. My wife and I moved back to this area after a 15-year absence. Between the Marine Corps and Walmart, we moved 11 times in 15 years, so you can figure that one out. And I joined the Brazos Genealogical Association, and I met an interesting individual. He, I'm sure, is probably well known and may have even spoken here as well. But if you're into genealogy and you haven't met Bill Page, or if you're into local history and you haven't met Bill Page, then you're missing out on a wonderful individual. Bill, actually, him and I share a common characteristic, and there is some evidence that we may be related, but that's, back to 1700. Anyway, that's another story. But Bill and I don't have anybody here in this community from our family. But we both believe that it's important for people who are doing genealogy or doing history in a community to give something back to that community, to contribute something. And Bill really inspired me to do that while I was associated with the group. So I thought about how could I contribute. Well, I've had a strong interest in the American Civil War for years and years. Stemmed back all the way back to the centennial back in the 60s, and no, I'm not that old, but I can remember some of the publications that my father purchased during that time. The Brazos Genealogical Association had at one time this grand plan to identify all the Union veterans and all the Confederate veterans that are buried here in the county and mark their grave. That is an extremely difficult project to do. And not only that, it's quasi-illegal because the VA won't give you a marker for those guys who are already marked. So I took that project because I had an interest in the Civil War and I had an interest in genealogy, and it's been a wonderful project. And I kind of changed it. And I said, well, let's just try to identify these guys, which is difficult to do, but also let's just mark the ones that are not marked. Okay? That'll be good enough. Well, Bill was kind enough, and if you know Bill, he's one I consider a list guy. If you ever ask for anything from Bill Page, he'll send you a ton of information, and it's all little blurbs of things that he has found everywhere, anywhere. I mean, it's amazing what this guy can come up with. So Bill said, hey, I got a list, a bunch of stuff here for you. Well, you can see how thick this is. I don't know how long he's been working on it. I got it bound a few years ago, but this is actually all of Bill's work. So on Civil War veterans in Brazos County, and it's just lists of names and people. And the only thing wrong with it, not really wrong with it, but difficult for me was that if somebody came through Brazos County and they said, hey, I was a veteran, or he found information about a veteran, and he came through Brazos County on the stagecoach, he's in this book. He's not buried here, but he's in this book. So I had to weed through some things. And in going through that process, I noticed that Bill had on some of these men noted biographical clippings at the Carnegie Library. Some of the early staff, as I'm sure everyone is aware, a lot of the early staff at A&M were veterans of the Civil War. But a lot of them are not buried here. Lawrence Sullivan Ross, I'm sure everybody knows, is buried in Waco. A couple of the other presidents, John James and Hardaway Hunt Dinwiddie, are actually buried in Austin. The president before, Sol Ross, I believe, is buried in Dallas. So this group of gentlemen who were of interest kept kind of falling out because they're not buried here. So they kept falling off my list. Well, I came to one gentleman by the name of William Bringhurst. And I started thinking, well, maybe perhaps this is somebody I need to look at because I don't know where he's buried. So I needed to make that determination. And so I went to the Cushing Library, and there is a file on him there. Trouble is, most of the information that was compiled on him stopped in the 1950s. And there's not a lot of stuff in there. There's little bits and pieces of some information about his life, but nothing really about where he's buried, what happened to him, anything. There's a nice photograph of him, but there wasn't a whole lot of information. But there were some clues in that file that I was able to use to try to determine, is he an individual? You know, this is crazy, and the people who are in genealogy know that all I want to know is the guy buried here. You know, is he buried here and is he a veteran? And so I had to make that determination through that file. So in doing that, this is what we're going to talk about today, is some of the things that I was able to find. So where is Dr. Bringhurst? So we're up to speed, right? He's a tied into the Sam Houston family, early staff at A&M, okay? Holy cow, that moved fast. Okay, that was it. No. Put the fly swatters down. Okay. Bringhurst was born in Alexandria, Louisiana, to Augustus and Maria Powers Bringhurst. I know a little bit about his parents. His father was born in Germantown, Pennsylvania. Bringhurst had been there for a few generations, had come down to Louisiana. I haven't done a lot of research on them. I don't know if he was into sugar cane or rice or cotton, but he was in Louisiana since about 1830s, and he is listed on the 1850 census as a planter. They did have money. For those of you who are interested, the Bringhurst family, his father did actually own 12 slaves, and so they were a little higher up on the social ladder at that time. So they were able to afford to send their son off to school. And where he started was the Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy. Thank goodness they changed their name when they merged the Louisiana State University that's now in Baton Rouge. But it actually started in Alexandria, Louisiana. And what we find is Bringhurst's first brush, I guess, with historical figures. Because the superintendent at the school was none other than William Tecumseh Sherman. And Bringhurst gives us this note where he talks about himself, and it's kind of interesting because he's saying, hey, I wasn't that good of a student. And he leaves this quote with us about Sherman's involvement, talking about the students as an untutored set and often provoked the disgust of the officers. And Sherman, I guess they didn't have anti-hazing laws back then, so Sherman put all the awkward ones in one squad, and Bringhurst was in that group for a while. Of course, this is about 1860. We all know what happens in 61. Bringhurst, you can tell from his age, 1862 rolls around, and he joins the Confederate Army at the age of 18, which is not to be unexpected from that period of time for someone in his position and state. So he's in the Army. And this slide probably should have been in front of the other one. There's a couple of people that intertwine, and as we do a lot of family history, you start seeing how the interconnectedness of people are. This gentleman here was one of the professors at the seminary. He also, when the seminary closed down at the beginning of the war, ran off and joined the Army, and was actually, from his memoirs, I guess you could say, spent some time with Stonewall Jackson in Virginia and was actually at Chancellorsville when Jackson was killed. So he actually was very proud of his service with Sherman at the seminary, and also likewise very proud with being with Stonewall Jackson. And then he is also assigned as a chief engineer at this Fort DeRussy. After the war, he comes back as president of a couple of universities. So he's an individual that helps Bringhurst out a little bit later on. I'm going to get this right sooner or later. Francis W. Smith is another gentleman who was a professor at the seminary. There was 5 professors with Sherman. Smith is a graduate of Virginia Military Institute. He's actually the nephew of the first superintendent. And I don't know how this ties together, but I think there is something there, so I went ahead and put his slide in. It'll come to light a little bit later on. Fort DeRussy is near Marksville, Louisiana. In the winter of 1863, Bringhurst is promoted to first lieutenant, and it's actually through Boyd, his professor, that he is able to obtain that promotion because Boyd's in charge of this fort. 1864, you've got General Banks coming through the Red River campaign, and they basically run over the fort. He has about 4,000 men. They storm the fort, and I think 250 men are taken prisoner, of which Bringhurst is one of them. So from the March of 1864 to January 1865, when he was paroled, this was his home. So as a young man, Bringhurst, I believe, spent his 20th birthday in prison in New Orleans. The gentleman there, he looks like he's in a Yankee uniform. That's actually the most earliest picture I could find of Henry Bates Stoddard. He's actually in a uniform of the Texas Volunteer Guard from about 1880, I believe, but that's the best picture I could find of him. He kind of reminds me of Ed Harris. But Henry Stoddard, upon an enfeebled enemy beyond what the necessity of conquering required. You could tell this guy had a way with words, and it's pretty interesting. So what happens after the war, after he gets out of prison? And I find bits and pieces of him. I can't tell you exactly what he did every year of his life, But he actually goes to Germany. And if we have any German-speaking folks in the audience, I apologize because I have no idea how to pronounce Tübingen. That's how I say it. It's the University of Tübingen in Germany, where he earns his Doctor of Philosophy in 1869. And then he kind of disappears. He's in Louisiana teaching. And then with the Texas Military Institute in Austin, when it opens up, he comes as one of its professors. And then in February of 1877, Bringhurst marries Sam Houston's youngest daughter in the governor's mansion. And the current governor, Hubbard, gives away the bride. I really would have liked to have found a photograph or anything of that ceremony, but unfortunately I couldn't. But this is where Bringhurst meets Sam Houston's youngest daughter, and they are married in the governor's mansion. And I believe she was going to school there in Austin. John Garland James, he is as some people know, is the second president of Texas A&M, or the A&M College of Texas at the time. He was also a graduate of VMI. He was a professor at not only Kentucky Military Institute, but he was a president of Texas Military Institute in Austin. So I think that there's some connection between the Superintendent Smith at VMI and his nephew and Bringhurst and James all tying in with the VMI-TMI connection. And really, as you'll see on the last one there, President A&M College of Texas, is really how Bringhurst came here to College Station. He didn't come originally with the first group, but he shows up in 1882 as a professor of physics. 1885, he's teaching English and history, chairman of the faculty, and then really his claim to fame, there for a period of 7 months, he was the interim president or the acting president of the university before Sol Ross actually arrived on site. And then in 1890, he served through Sol Ross's term, or at that time as his vice president of the university or the college. And then in 1893, he resigned. I do not know why he left the university or why he left the college. I have not found any information on that. He had a pretty rough family life. You can see there's a lot of born and died dates on there with his children. Sam Houston Bringhurst was born in Austin with the couple early on, and then later died in Henderson. He had another son that was born and lived to be 2 years old, died in Austin. William Stewart Bringhurst, or Willie, was actually born here and died here, and he is buried in the Bryan City Cemetery. And then Anna Catherine, the little 5-year-old who hadn't had a marker for 112 years, she also was born and died in this area. The only one that survived was the one daughter, and she died in 1934. And as the photograph is actually Nettie Houston, Sam Houston's youngest daughter. She died in 1932 from the result of a automobile accident. They were on the way to see her brother in Houston. She died in 1932, and her daughter, the young lady listed here, died 2 years later, pretty much as a result of that accident as well. So it was really kind of a tough deal. Bringhurst, once he left A&M, he had some positions here. He taught high school in Bryan for a while, and then he was named the president of the Normal College in Henderson. That's why he had that one son who was buried up there. And then he went down to San Antonio and was a teacher of ancient languages in the high school down there. That's also when Nettie Houston became very much involved in the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. I believe she's written a lot of poems. She promoted the Alamo, her father's reputation, and all of those things. And then in the early 1900s, Bringhurst moves to the State Orphans Home in Corsicana. And that's where he dies on February 8th, 1913, after a 4-day bout with pneumonia. Now, this is a newspaper from the Dallas Morning News, And it talks about his body leaving Corsicana for Brian. And it talks about some of the other things that's going on, but it doesn't really tell me if he was buried here. I'm assuming he was. So we looked for, okay, we now knew when he died, and he's a pretty prominent individual, so let's look and see if we can find something else. The Brian Daly Eagle talks about, and I think we have a little thing here. Yeah, there it is. I don't know if y'all can see that or not. It talks about right here, the funeral took place from the train, the body being laid to rest in the city cemetery with Masonic honors. So I'm thinking perhaps, okay, there is a, you know, as a historian or as a family historian or genealogist, you always kind of want to have somebody else confirm something. And I'm positive, and I don't know if there's anyone from the newspaper, but I don't, you know, the newspaper prints what they're told. And sometimes people make up stories. So you have to be a little skeptical sometimes. And then Henry Bates Stoddard over here, the gentleman who was in prison with him, wrote a real nice article after his death too, and talked about some of his, gave a little quote there. And there were some other things in here about you know, Bringhurst would share what he got from people, from friends while he was in prison, whatever he had, but insisting on denying himself to help Stoddard out. So they were fairly close individuals. Okay, but I don't know if he was still, I still don't know if he's here. So, and some of you are saying, well, come on, dude, the obituary just said that. Okay. So I went back and so we looked and tried to find out where did he get shipped from. Well, the funeral home, thank goodness to the Daughters of the American Revolution, because they transcribed the records of this funeral home, and it's in the library in Corsicana, but all it says is the body was shipped to Brian. And there's no funeral home here accepting the body, so there's no records here to verify as well. We went out to the cemetery to see if they had the records, and of course, the genealogists in the audience, how many times have you seen this? The records are missing from the time that he died. I mean, come on. So, but we did know that his son was buried there, and he did purchase this lot in the cemetery. And that's also where little Katie is buried. So we're still not sure what's going on. So I thought, well, okay, the obituary said he was buried with Masonic honors. And so I thought, well, maybe the Masonic Lodge might have something. And lo and behold, they were gracious enough to open their doors and pull out their meeting book. And there's this note in there. It's dated 1913, but it's in between the minutes from the 17th of February and the 24th. So we have the date in there is about right. But it talks about right here, lodge was open in the master's degree in due and ancient form, called for the purpose of attending the burial of Brother Bringhurst. And again, you see his friend Henry Bates Stoddard up here as the worshipful master. So they were called from labor. This is Masonic terminology I'm not familiar with. They were called from labor and attended the funeral, after which a return to the lodge room was called to labor. Well, for those of you who are familiar with Brian, you know where the Brazos Union Lodge is and you know where the cemetery is. So they had a meeting. They suspended basically, went to the cemetery and came back. We see some of the same names here as the members present as are listed in the obituary. So for me, this confirmed that he is buried in the Bryan City Cemetery. So we're happy, right? We're happy. We found him. He's there. He's in there. Now we got to go to the VA and say, hey, can we have a marker? Because we know he's service. But we run into another problem. Simple little things drive you crazy. What is his full name? The A&M Archives lists him as most of the time you see him, all the information in Bill's book is W.L. Bringhurst. Everything. The University Archives has him as William Lorraine Bringhurst. This guy wrote a history on the Bringhurst family, and his name is William Stewart Bringhurst. So I'm like, okay, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. I want to know what his name is. So when I put a marker that lasts for 500 years or more, somebody will come and say, well, that's, they won't come there and like, who's the guy that put the marker? I've got the name wrong, So I thought, well, we needed to do a little bit more. This is actually the page out of this book here on the history of the Bringhurst family. And it plainly says that his name is Stuart Bringhurst. So I'm like, well, could people have mistranscribed the L or the S to an L and messed it up? But, so I never could figure that out. So I said, okay, I dig a little deeper. So I go to the Barker History Center in Austin. They have the newspaper from the Texas Military Institute. Thinking, well, perhaps they might have something, because I knew from his life this is probably a source that we can look at. Well, even they get confused. Because in December of 1875, they say, hey, we've got this Major W.S. Bringhurst coming. German University, gentleman, affable manners, and in his method of teaching has impressed his classes. Okay. But in February the next year, he's listed as Major W.L. Bringhurst in the staff directory in the favor. So I'm like, okay, what is going on? So then I go back to his Civil War record, and there's a volume, 3 volumes that Andrew Booth put together. And he's listed as W.S., but then to muddy the waters even more, and I'm sorry about this slide, it says on federal rolls of prisoners of war as W.S.L. Bringhurst. Now, if you were going to be captured by the government, I think you'd probably give them your, well, I don't know, maybe you wouldn't, but I think that would be something that you would give them your full name. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm leaning towards that's why there's confusion, because it's both his name. So I'm thinking, okay, where else can I look? All right. I thought y'all might enjoy this. The internet's a wonderful thing. And I thought, okay, I wonder if the people over in Germany know anything about this guy. So I send over an email and say, do you have a copy? And I was hoping to get a copy of his dissertation is really what I wanted to do, but from 1869 to 2001, there was a lot of things happening in Germany. So they didn't have it anymore. But they sent me this note back, and I'm not real, well, I don't speak or write or read or anything German, so, but you can pick it out. You can really pick it out. It says William Stuart L. Bringhurst on August 11th, 1869, got his philosophy degree, and his dissertation was, I can't speak Latin either, Defending Cervantes or something along those lines. Well, you can read that, but you can also do, for those of you who don't know, there is a free Translatorcom. So if somebody sends you something like this, you can just key it in, and it comes up with what they said, which is really kind of cool, but even Translator.com didn't know what this word is here, and I have no idea either. But that was okay because, it's all right, and the one thing is, if everybody who doesn't know German, okay, Ermilla, Bauer, okay? Bauer means farmer, all right? So now you know one word in German, okay? So this really kind of confirmed it for me also that, okay, that's why there's confusion, because his real name is William Stuart Lorraine Bringhurst, and that's what we applied to his marker. So after 94 years, Bringhurst finally gets a marker. We had some folks get together and provide a marker back here for his daughter. This is his son, William Stewart, Willie, and little Katie is buried here. And then we got the marker for Dr. Bringhurst. And I don't have a picture of the back, but we actually inscribed on the back his full name. I had to get that on there because the VA, it would be in a big circle and you would try to figure out where to start. But the back has his full name on it and some of his activities with the college and some of the things that he did in his life. So it's just a simple little project that turned into this big adventure. And the one thing I think that really make it worthwhile for me when I do genealogy is not looking up the records of people who have gone before, but it really gives you an opportunity to meet people who are related to your subjects. So the day we had the dedication, Miss Ross and her son came down from Cincinnati, Ohio. They didn't come down specifically for the ceremony. They were here because they go to Huntsville every year for the ceremony on Sam Houston. But they were gracious enough to come over for the day that we did this. And speaking to Claude, now Margaret is the daughter of the lady who died in '34. And when her mother died, she moved to Cincinnati and basically took some mementos from the Houston family, but she really never knew anything. And Claude told me during the ceremony, we always thought he was buried in Corsicana. So it was nice to meet them and to visit with them a little bit, and it really made the project worthwhile. So the moral of the story: capitalize on your interests. For me, it was a little bit of genealogy, a little bit of Civil War history, a little bit of A&M history. Contribute your efforts. It doesn't take a whole lot. I mean, well, we went through this today. Like, well, that's too much for me to do, you know. But it is fun. And then, you know, help preserve the history. You don't have to be local. I'm sure we have a ton of people who are local. I'm probably in a minority here in terms of that. But you really don't have to be local to contribute. You can find things and build the history of our community. So that's it.